Right, let's turn to this now. A meeting has been held to discuss progress made in strengthening public-private partnerships. It forms part of efforts to help grow the country's struggling economy. For more on this, we're joined now by Business for South Africa Steering Committee Chair, Martin Kingston. Martin, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time and coming on this evening.
Evening, Thabo.
So it stems, of course, from a number of other meetings that government would have had with business previously, of course, to try and come up with a new consensus. But this particular one came as a result of the July meeting which you held, and it was becoming very clear that load shedding is becoming a problem, and we need to achieve a level of energy security. Also, we needed to improve efficiency from a logistics point of view, and we needed to reduce the violent crime, which was beginning to hamper on the image of the country, both in the public but also in the markets. And business thought, we want to help, we want to bring in support, we want to bring in skills, and you set up a whole number of structures in all these areas, in terms of energy, in terms of freight, and in terms of the security space. Set yourself a target to say in 3 months we'll meet and see where we are and push on that momentum. Where are you in 3 months in terms of the 5 priority areas, for example, in energy?
Well, in fact, Thabo, we've been meeting every 6 weeks with the President and his cabinet colleagues, and we've agreed last night that we'll do so again in about 6 weeks' time. So this was the 3rd such meeting. We were able to take stock and brief the President on the progress that's been made in this collaboration between business and government in these 3 areas, as you've outlined: energy, transport and logistics, and crime and corruption, which are really binding constraints, both on confidence levels and therefore on economic growth. If we don't have investment by the private sector at scale, we're not going to get inclusive economic growth, and we're not going to address the biggest single challenge, of course, of unemployment. And so having identified these 3 constraints, we think that they contribute between 3 and 5% to GDP growth. We've agreed on specific work streams where we as business are partnering with government. You'll remember that in August of last year, the President announced the Energy Action Plan and the establishment of the National Energy Crisis Committee that was specifically designed both to integrate government efforts, but with the explicit goal of minimizing and eventually eradicating load shedding. 10 work streams in that particular focus area. Business is participating in 8 of them. We've mobilized, as you said, expertise, subject matter experts with the necessary insights and experience to work alongside counterparts in government and indeed in Eskom. And I think we've got a realistic view as to how long it'll take, but establishing the structures, the areas of priority focus and appropriate governance was the first step. That's now been completed, and we're starting to get traction in terms of specific interventions that can be taken, whether it's the energy availability factor at power stations, or whether it's dealing with other operational considerations, that's working obviously with Eskom, or indeed whether it's communications, ensuring that we can reduce demand wherever possible. I need to emphasize, Thabo, that what we're not doing is straying into the domain of government responsibility, which of course is the development and the implementation of policy, although we give input when that is sought, and we all have views on that. But in the context of implementation, we all know that's a critical constraint. Capacity is equally a challenge for government. The President has admitted as much oftentimes, and there we're bringing real resource to bear, led by chief executives from a number of companies in South Africa. 130 chief executives have signed a pledge to support this initiative. So I feel that in energy, if our goal, which it is to eradicate load shedding by the end of next year, we're well on the way, and I'd like to think that in 2 or 3 months' time, we'll start to see progress being made that we can report on in a manner that is credible and tangible.
Yeah. So one of the various structures, of course, that would have been established, you're correct when you say it's NECOM, and also attached to that would have been something called a resource mobilization fund. How much money has that fund been able to raise, and is it being dispatched and being used, particularly around plant performance, which is really quite key? We have seen during winter that others were predicting that the stages of load shedding would be quite severe. But we seemingly were not that bad. Even though we were bad, but we were not as bad as one would have thought we would be.
Well, I mean, of course, load shedding has a number of effects. It saps confidence for all of us as citizens, but more importantly, it's a huge constraint on business activity, let alone new investment. And so it's absolutely essential that it's addressed as quickly as possible, but in a sustainable manner. The Resource Mobilisation Fund that you're talking about was put in place, again, at the request of government, in parallel with the work that I'm talking about from Business for South Africa. It raised 100 million rand to procure specialist expertise, which is actually donated to the government so the government can capacitate on its side of the table, whether it be legal skills, communication skills, project management capabilities, or policy expertise. All of that has now been made available to government. It's in situ, and it's actually sitting alongside government in the work that we're doing in the context of the Energy Action Plan, as I said.
Yeah. As far as then the new generation capacity is concerned, we know, for example, as part of the Operation Vulindlela structural reforms, one of the things that government says they managed to achieve is to at least open up that threshold to allow for private producers of electricity to come on board. As far as new generation capacity, outside of that, is there anything new or at least an indicator from business that says we are moving in the right direction in getting new generation on board?
Yes, there's a lot of new capacity that's being built up. We hope that Bid Window 7 will be launched soon. The Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill is an absolutely key enabler, Thabo, and that is now wending its way through Parliament. That will enable much more power to be brought onto the grid from the private sector, and it will enable the restructuring of Eskom, which again is a key ingredient to open up the sector, to see us having the power that we need at an affordable and predictable basis.
And what is the conversation, I mean, when you look each other in the eye and you're sitting with the president and the executives around the fact that Treasury is saying, folks, we actually don't have money, and we are at a point where we might need to go borrow again, but we can't continue to be signing checks and spending as if we've got unlimited resources. How do you drum that into their heads?
Well, I don't think that we need to do any drumming, actually, Thabo, because the Minister of Finance has been very clear. He was at the meeting yesterday, as was the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, the Minister of Public Enterprises, the Minister for Electricity. So all of the key ministers were there. There were some 10 ministers in attendance, covering the portfolios of energy, transport and logistics, and crime and corruption. We believe that actually the private sector can mobilize very significant funding under an appropriately regulated environment once the conditions are right. The conditions, of course, means that we implement the necessary structural reform as a country. We've made those recommendations many times as business to not only the President but to his cabinet colleagues. And indeed, the economic plans of the government take those into consideration. To do that, we've got to stabilize the platform, whether it be the platform in energy, the platform in transportation. And if business, as I indicated, is able to bring resources, expertise, skills and capacity to the table, not just finance, but as I said, some subject matter experts, that's a critical way in which we can take the agenda forward as quickly as we can, arrest the decline that we've seen in energy, in transportation and logistics, for example, the very pernicious levels of crime and corruption that we're seeing both in the public and in the private sector. That's what we will do. Of course, all of this comes, as you say, at a cost to the economy. We think that in a properly regulated environment, with suitable risk-adjusted returns, the private sector has an appropriate role to play as a partner to the state in many of these areas of activity.
So one of the things we have been reporting on, Martin, at least in the last 2 days, is the traffic jam at the Libombo border post. And one of the priorities as far as the National Logistics Crisis Committee would have been to deploy intervention teams to improve road transport operations and border transit, including security and congestion on the N2, N3 and N4. So when we look at that picture, it feels as though not much progress is being made on that score.
Well, of course, Thabo, the reason why we're seeing those jams in significant part is because we've seen a sort of an erosion of capacity and capability with respect to both rail and port, and in the context of rail, a transition to the roads, very problematic in a whole host of respects, as you have indicated. We have to fix Transnet. We need to make sure that we've got a sort of if you like, a roadmap in place. In fact, there's a freight logistics roadmap that is going to go to Cabinet imminently. That will in many respects be the energy action plan for the transport and logistics sector. Once again, we have mobilized subject matter experts, particularly with respect to the operational constraints with regards to rail and port, but we're also bringing subject matter experts to look at how we can relieve the constraints with respect to the road system. Yeah. The reality, Thabo, as we all need to just acknowledge, is that it's going to take time to reverse the decline that is set in, to capacitate these structures appropriately, to make sure that we've got suitable systems, processes and governance in place. When I say we, I'm not talking about the private sector. I'm talking about, South Africa as a whole. That takes time. We need to manage everybody's expectations, but the mobilization of the capabilities that I've talked about, the creation of the National Logistics Crisis Committee, similar to the National Energy Crisis Committee, is a critical first step in that process, having agreed on the areas where we must focus our efforts, where we must intervene, having, as I said, galvanized the private sector or the business community in the way in which we have on a coordinated and aligned basis. We think that we can be a trustworthy and responsible partner to the state in addressing those issues.
Yeah. Have you reached a point where you can indicate when that access agreement, for example, would be in place? Or are you saying that is largely dependent on the finalization of the national rail policy being adopted, being signed, and being approved?
No, it is absolutely dependent upon that, and we're pushing very hard for it to be adopted as quickly as possible so that everybody can consider their appropriate role. I need to emphasize that by the same token, we need to recognize what is the purview of the state and what is the purview of the private sector. We need to be very mindful of conflicts. We need to respect the integrity and the independence of state-owned enterprises, of the role and responsibility of the state with respect to the setting and the implementation of policy. But that doesn't mean that the private sector, both in assisting now, capacitating some of these processes, making sure that the interventions can take place, monitoring them regularly, and indeed, as we agreed yesterday with the President, agreeing a critical path, making that public in terms of key events and milestones we expect to pass in the coming months, and then accounting to the public at large. That's all part and parcel of the process of making sure that there's transparency, accountability, and that people take responsibility for what has to be done at scale and urgently to address, as I said, many of the headwinds that we've encountered over the past few years.
Yeah. One of the warnings that you would have given government at the time when you met with them was that we are looking in the eye a possibility of being a failed state. What do you make today when you hear the Public Service Commission almost giving a similar warning?
Yeah, so I'm aware of the Public Service Commission having said that. We actually discussed it yesterday. South Africa is not a failed state. The reality is that there are many challenges that have to be overcome. I think we need to be cautious about sort of over-dramatizing in the way in which we describe these challenges, what the ramifications might be. That doesn't mean that we're not in a crisis and being confronted by some very significant headwinds. We have to acknowledge those crises. We have to determine how we deal with them. But what's for sure is that in a number of respects, we've made progress as a country. There are green shoots appearing in many areas of the economy, and not as many as we require. I should point out that if we don't grow at more than 3% per annum in terms of unemployment, we effectively either stand still or swell the ranks of the unemployment. Well, for an economy that, as you know, is currently producing less than 1% growth per annum, that's a hugely problematic set of circumstances. We think that if we deal with crime and corruption in an effective way, we bring perpetrators to account, both, as I said, in the public and the private sector. If we address the constraints of the transportation system and indeed the energy constraints, we think that that can contribute between 3 and 5% to GDP. And as I said earlier on, it can lift confidence levels very significantly. Confidence levels are a necessary underpin to the level of investment that's required to drive sustainable growth and address those unemployment challenges.
Yeah. Let's look at the third focal point that you would have to have looked at. One is to build up the capacity of the NPA. Last night we had a conversation with the Deputy Minister around the NPA amendment bill and the establishment of an investigative directorate that would be a permanent feature now to investigate corruption. Did that come up in your meetings, and is business satisfied that that is the right direction?
It absolutely did come up in the meeting. Indeed, the head of the NPA, Shimona Batoy, was there, as was the Minister of Justice, Ronald Lamola. It was very specifically discussed. The Independent Directorate Bill has been on the agenda for our discussions with government since we launched this process. It is wending its way again through the parliamentary process. It needs to be accelerated. In the area of crime and corruption, we can certainly provide technical skill and assistance. But as in the other areas, perhaps even more so, we need to be particularly mindful of the need to have an arm's length relationship, not to compromise, as I said, the independence or integrity of the criminal justice cluster. But that doesn't mean that we can't be of assistance. If we look specifically at the impact on both energy and transportation, infrastructure theft featured very significantly in our discussions, as did the issue of illegal mining. It's only by collaborating effectively and by very clear intervention that we're going to address it. In the case of businesses' commitment, we are repurposing Business Against Crime, which has been housed until now within Business Leadership South Africa. It'll be capacitated appropriately, it'll have suitable governance put in place, and it'll integrate the full business response in respect of crime and corruption. The Minister of Police emphasized the need to deal with all forms of crime, and we are very sensitive to those issues. So these matters that you have raised are discussed very openly, very frankly. I'd like to think in the spirit of constructive partnership and collaboration, but where we need to see how we can focus on particular areas where we can make a difference in the shortest possible time frame, where we can actually increase, as I said, confidence levels, trust by society at large in both the role of the state and indeed the role of the private sector, let alone collaborating together. And I think that the message that has come through loud and clear, particularly yesterday, is the power of that collaboration can make a very significant difference in addressing these three areas. There are other areas, obviously, that need to be dealt with, but at the moment we are relentlessly focusing upon these three. If they're successful, then we can scale them elsewhere in due course.
Yeah. While we are there, maybe just before we pass on that, what lessons could possibly have been learned, as you mentioned, that especially when it comes to the justice and the crime cluster, exercising that arm's length kind of intervention, when it comes to the ESCOM investigation that could have been funded by the private sector. What did you learn from that situation, how it could be better handled going forward?
Well, I think that the first point I would make is that, Business Leadership South Africa has, many times explained the basis on which it was approached for that ESCOM investigation. If we feel that there is real and systemic corruption in any of these organizations, and we're able to assist, not by being involved in the investigation itself, but by facilitating appropriate investigation which withstands scrutiny, then surely that's an appropriate route for us to pursue. We know that actually corruption within these organizations, and it's not just state-owned enterprises, but I know that that's featured particularly in the context of the Zondo Commission, needs to be eradicated as quickly as possible because it prevents any viable operations from emerging. I'm not even talking about the morality of crime and corruption. I'm talking about the economic viability of the operations concerned, and it needs to be comprehensively addressed, not just, by the way, in the public sector, but equally we must hold ourselves to account in the private sector as well. And some successful prosecutions, we think, will be the best way of measuring progress wherever those prosecutions take place. And we know that the MPA sits at the very centre of that. Clearly, the private sector, can't participate in those processes. All we can do is capacitate and facilitate the MPA being, as well resourced and capacitated, as I said, as possible under the circumstances. But this all takes time. And yet again, as you said earlier on, Tabo, in highly constrained fiscal circumstances, we'll see what the Minister of Finance has to say when he tables his medium-term budget policy statement at the beginning of November. But he's already indicated that we're going to have to tighten our belts and that austerity may well be, the order of the day.
Martin Kingston, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on and that intervention there tonight. Chair of the Steering Committee on Business for South Africa.